The phone would ring with a persistence that felt almost hopeful, a sound that had become the soundtrack to my simmering resentment. For 7 years, it was the same story. Margaret, my mother, would call, her name flashing on the screens of 3 different households, and in 2 of them, her call would be deliberately, silently, sent to voicemail. In mine, it was always answered. I was the family's designated worrier, the emotional switchboard operator. The calls were never emergencies. They were small, delicate offerings of connection. She'd talk about the finches at her bird feeder, describing their squabbles with the gentle amusement of someone with time to notice such things. She'd recount the plot of a black-and-white movie she'd watched the night before, or ask, for the 3rd time that month, how my son Thomas was doing in his algebra class. Her world had grown smaller, contained within the 4 walls of her quiet house, and her calls were simply a way to open a window, to let a little bit of our lives in. After each call, the ritual would begin. I'd open the family group chat, a digital space that felt more like a courtroom every day. "Spoke to Mom," I'd type. "She sounds a bit lonely but is doing okay. Sends her love." The replies when they came were always variations on a theme. Karen, my sister, would respond hours later, usually with a photo of her perfectly curated life. A new handbag, a fancy dinner, her kids at a polo match. "So glad you checked in, Elle. I've been swamped. We're just heading to the Hamptons for the weekend. Tell Mom I'll call her next week." She never did. For Karen, our mother had become an item on a to-do list, one that was perpetually pushed to the bottom. Michael, my brother, was different, but no better. He valued efficiency above all else. "Why doesn't she just text?" he'd reply almost instantly. "Calling is so inefficient. I've got back-to-back meetings. Can't be tied to the phone." He'd tried to onboard our 84-year-old mother to various messaging apps, failing to grasp that it wasn't the information she craved, but the simple human warmth of a voice. Their excuses were a constant corrosive drip of acid on my soul. At first, I made excuses for them. They were busy, I'd tell myself. They had demanding careers, younger children, complicated lives. My life was simpler. I worked from home, and Thomas, my son, was a self-sufficient teenager. It was easier for me. But 7 years is a long time. Over 7 years, busy becomes unwilling. It becomes a choice. I was the middle child, the perpetual peacemaker, and I had stayed quiet to avoid conflict. Confronting Michael and Karen would lead to a fight. It would be my word against theirs, my oversensitivity against their practicality. They would accuse me of trying to make them feel guilty, of not understanding the pressures they were under. And so, for 7 years, I said nothing. I absorbed the responsibility and the resentment and the quiet heartbreak of hearing the disappointment in my mother's voice when she'd ask, "Have you heard from your brother or your sister?" "They're just very busy, Mom," I'd say, the lie tasting like ash in my mouth. The only one who seemed to understand was my son Thomas. He grew from a 9-year-old boy into a 16-year-old young man against the backdrop of these one-sided phone calls. He would sit at the kitchen island doing his homework, listening to my conversations with Margaret. He heard the love in her voice and the strain in mine. "Why don't Aunt Karen and Uncle Michael ever talk to Grandma?" he asked me one evening, his eyes filled with a clarity that only the young possess. I gave him the usual excuses. "They have a lot going on, honey." He just shook his head, unconvinced. "She sounds nice," he said. "I like hearing about her birds." On his own, Thomas started to forge a bond with her. When I called her, he'd ask to say hello. He'd tell her about his day, a video game he was playing, or a book he was reading for school. He'd listen, really listen, as she told him stories of her own childhood. He treated her not as a burden, but as a treasure, a living link to a past he'd only ever seen in faded photographs. It was a beautiful thing to witness, but it also sharpened the edges of my anger. A 16-year-old boy had more time for his great-grandmother than her own children did. The silence I kept was the price of a fragile family peace, but I was beginning to realize who was paying the highest cost. It was Margaret. The light in her voice, the one that flickered with the hope of connection, was dimming with every passing year. And I, her dutiful daughter, was standing by and letting it happen. I was the keeper of our family's conscience, a role I had never asked for, and one that was becoming heavier than I could bear. I just didn't know that the single event that would shatter my silence was just a week away. The call that changed everything came on a Tuesday. It was a day like any other. I was sorting through emails, Thomas was at school, and the house was quiet. The phone rang, and I saw Margaret's name. I smiled, ready to hear about the dramatic escapades of a particularly greedy squirrel. But the voice on the other end was not my mother's usual gentle, meandering tone. It was thin, breathless, and laced with a pain that shot through the line and directly into my heart. "Eleanor," she whispered. "Mom, what is it? What's wrong?" My own voice was sharp with sudden fear. I fell, dear, in the kitchen. My hip. I think I'm okay, but I can't seem to get up." There was a pause, and then the words that would ignite the firestorm. I tried calling Michael and Karen. So many times. They didn't answer. 7 years of suppressed anger, of polite texts and bitten-back words, coalesced into a single blinding point of white-hot rage. They hadn't just missed a call about the birds. They had missed the one that mattered. She had been on the floor, hurt and scared, reaching out for her children, and only one had answered. "I'm coming, Mom. Just stay on the phone with me. Don't move. I'll be there in 15 minutes. My hands were shaking as I grabbed my keys. I drove faster than I should have, my mind a maelstrom of terror and fury. What if it was serious? What if she'd been lying there for hours? The image of her, small and frail on the cold linoleum, was unbearable. The excuses I had made for my siblings for years now seemed not just flimsy, but grotesque. Too busy, inefficient, swamped. I found her exactly as I had pictured. She was propped up against the kitchen cabinets, her face pale, one leg twisted at an awkward angle. A carton of milk was spilled on the floor beside her, a stark white puddle in the afternoon light. Relief washed over me when she gave me a weak, pained smile. She was conscious. She was talking. "Oh, Eleanor," she said, her voice trembling. "I'm so sorry to be a bother." "Don't you dare be sorry," I said, my own voice thick with emotion as I knelt beside her, checking her over. "You are never, ever a bother." After a careful examination by a paramedic and a long conversation with her doctor, the news was mercifully good. It was a bad sprain, not a break. She was severely bruised and shaken, but she would be okay. The paramedic, a kind man with gentle eyes, helped me get her settled into her favorite armchair, a heating pad on her hip and a cup of sweet tea in her hands. As I cleaned up the spilled milk, my rage returned, cold and hard and clear. I looked at the call log on her phone. She had called Michael 3 times. She had called Karen 4 times, all within the last hour. Then finally, she had called me. I sat in the chair opposite her, my phone heavy in my hand. For years, I had been the family's shock absorber. I had cushioned the blows of their neglect, translating their indifference into palatable excuses. I had protected them from the consequences of their own selfishness, and I had protected my mother from the full, painful truth of it. But in that moment, I saw with terrifying clarity that my silence hadn't been peacekeeping. It had been enablement. My quiet diplomacy had almost cost my mother hours of pain and fear. It was a price I was no longer willing to pay. I opened the group chat. My fingers flew across the screen, no longer measured or polite. The dam had broken. "Mom had a fall in the kitchen," I typed. "She was on the floor for nearly an hour because she couldn't get up. She tried calling both of you multiple times. Neither of you answered." I didn't add that she was okay. I wanted them to feel, for just a moment, the same bolt of terror that had shot through me. I wanted the silence that followed my message to be filled with their panic, their guilt. Karen's reply came first, 10 minutes later. A string of shocked emojis followed by, "Oh my God, is she okay? I was in a meeting, my phone was on silent. I'm so sorry. Should I come over?" The offer felt hollow, a performative gesture now that the crisis was over. Michael's was, as always, infuriatingly practical. "That's terrible. Is she being transported? Which hospital? I'm in the middle of a major project launch, but I can try to move some things around." He was already managing the logistics, deflecting the emotion. I looked at their messages, at the familiar dance of feigned concern and logistical detachment. For the first time, I felt no obligation to soften the blow. I was done being the buffer. I typed my reply, each word a small, hard stone. "She's okay. No thanks to either of you. We need to talk. A real conversation. This can't happen again." I hit send, and the message landed in the digital space between us like a grenade. The pin pulled, and the countdown started. The fragile peace I had maintained for 7 years was officially over. I insisted on a video call that evening. No more hiding behind text messages and emojis. I wanted to see their faces when I said what needed to be said. Margaret was asleep, exhausted from her ordeal, her breathing soft and regular in the quiet of her house. I was staying the night on her sofa, a vigil I hadn't kept since I was a teenager. The living room, filled with the scent of lavender and old books, became my war room. They appeared on my phone screen, framed by their own separate, perfect worlds. Karen was in her pristine white kitchen, a glass of wine artfully placed on the marble countertop beside her. Michael was in his home office, the background blurred to obscure whatever corporate secrets lay behind him, making him look like a floating, disembodied head of disapproval. "Eleanor, darling, I feel absolutely dreadful," Karen began, her voice a carefully modulated performance of remorse. "I was in a final presentation with a new client. My phone was in my bag. You know how it is." "I've already ordered a medical alert system for her," Michael announced, cutting in before I could respond. It wasn't an apology, it was a solution. A problem had been identified and a system had been implemented. Emotion, as always, was an unnecessary variable. "It will be installed on Friday. The premium package, GPS-enabled, fall detection, instant connection to emergency services. That should prevent this from happening again." I looked at their faces on the screen, at my sister's performative guilt, and my brother's infuriating pragmatism, and I felt something snap. "A medical alert system?" I said, my voice dangerously quiet. "That's your solution? You think this is a technical problem? This isn't about fall detection, Michael. This is about son and daughter detection. And for 7 years, the two of you have failed." Karen flinched, her hand flying to her chest in mock surprise. "Eleanor, that is completely unfair." "Unfair?" My laugh was brittle, humorless. "I'll tell you what's unfair. It's unfair that our mother lay on a cold floor for an hour, thinking her children wouldn't answer her call. It's unfair that I am the only one who has to hear the loneliness in her voice week after week. I am the one who has to listen to her talk about her birds and her movies because she is desperate for a human voice, while you two are too swamped and inefficient to pick up the phone." I was using their own words, throwing their excuses back at them like stones. I saw the flash of anger in Michael's eyes. "I run a department of 50 people, Eleanor. My time is not my own. A phone call can derail an entire afternoon. It's not that I don't want to talk to her, but you don't," I interrupted, my voice rising. "You don't want to. Neither of you do. Because it's not efficient. It's not glamorous. It doesn't close a deal or look good on Instagram. It's just a conversation with an old woman who gave us everything. And you can't even give her 5 minutes of your time. My son, my 16-year-old son, has more time for her than you do. He asks her questions. He listens to her stories. He doesn't see her as a burden. He sees her as his great-grandmother." The mention of Thomas hung in the air between us, an unspoken accusation that was more powerful than anything I could have said. It highlighted the profound, pathetic nature of their failure. Karen's face hardened. The remorse evaporated, replaced by the defensive anger I knew so well. "Oh, here we go. Saint Eleanor, on her high horse. You think we don't feel bad? You think we don't love her? It's easy for you, Elle. You have a flexible job. Your life isn't as complicated as ours." "Don't you dare," I hissed. "Don't you dare use my life as an excuse for your neglect. I made it my business to be available. That was the difference. I chose to. You chose not to. Every single time you saw her name on your phone and swiped it away, that was a choice." "This is pointless," Michael said, his voice clipped. "Yelling at us isn't going to solve anything. The alert system is a practical measure. I'll also set up a shared calendar for calls. We can schedule them. 15 minutes, once a week, for each of us. That will ensure she has regular contact." He was still trying to solve it like a business problem. A calendar invite, a scheduled interaction. He didn't understand that a mother's need for her children couldn't be confined to a 15-minute slot on a Tuesday afternoon. It wasn't about a schedule. It was about the heart. It was about knowing that if you fall, someone will answer the phone. "I'm done," I said, the fight suddenly draining out of me, replaced by a vast, weary sadness. "I am done covering for you. I'm done making excuses. I'm done being the family's emotional switchboard." I looked from one screen to the other, at the two people who were supposed to be my partners in this, my allies. They were strangers, disconnected from the simple, vital reality of what it meant to be a son or a daughter. "She's your mother, too," I said softly. "It's time you two figured out what that means." I ended the call. I didn't slam the phone down. I just pressed the red button, and their faces vanished. The silence that filled the room was different. It wasn't the tense, resentful silence I had been holding in for years. It was a clean, quiet, empty space. The truth was out. The pieces of our family lay shattered on the floor, and I felt no obligation to be the one to pick them up. For the first time in a very long time, I felt a profound sense of release. The day after the confrontation was defined by a profound and ringing silence. I woke up on my mother's sofa to the gentle morning light. My anger from the night before cooled into a strange, hollow calm. There were no good morning texts in the group chat, No frantic, apologetic phone calls. It was as if I had thrown a stone into a deep well and was now left listening for a splash that never came. My focus was Margaret. I made her oatmeal the way she liked it, with a little too much brown sugar. I helped her walk to the sunroom, where she could watch her beloved finches. She was sore and moving slowly, but her spirit was brighter. She was blissfully unaware of the war I had declared in her name. "Did you sleep all right on that lumpy old thing?" she asked, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "Slept like a log, Mom," I lied, pouring her a cup of tea. The first ripple from my stone arrived just after lunch. It wasn't a call. It was a series of calendar invitations that popped up on my phone. Scheduled call with Margaret, Michael. Wednesday, 2 p.m. to 2:15 p.m. Scheduled call with Margaret, Karen. Thursday, 11 a.m. to 11:15 a.m. I stared at the notifications, a bitter laugh bubbling in my chest. This was Michael's response. Not an apology, not a conversation, a schedule. A quantifiable 15-minute block of time inserted into his ruthlessly efficient life. He had taken my raw, emotional plea for connection and translated it into a corporate workflow. He had solved the problem. The next day, a delivery truck pulled up. 2 men carried an enormous, cellophane-wrapped tower of fruit and flowers to the door. The basket was so large it was comical, filled with imported cheeses, exotic fruits, and more orchids than I could count. The card was small, almost an afterthought. The handwriting was a perfect, impersonal script. "Dearest Mother, so terribly sorry to hear about your fall. Wishing you a speedy recovery. All our love, Karen, Bob, and the children." It was a grand gesture that screamed of guilt and distance. It was something you sent to a business associate or a distant relative. It was a beautiful, expensive, and utterly empty apology. Karen had spent money, but she hadn't spent a single moment of her time. When the medical alert system technician arrived on Friday, Margaret was mostly confused. "But why do I need this, Eleanor? You're here." "It's from Michael, Mom," I explained, my voice carefully neutral as the young man installed the base station and showed her the button on the wristband. "It's just a precaution. It'll make him feel better." "It's not about making you feel safer," I thought. "It's about making him feel less guilty." I helped her put the wristband on. It looked alien against her soft, wrinkled skin, a piece of cold technology designed to do the job her own children wouldn't. That evening, Thomas came over for dinner. He walked into the living room, saw the ostentatious gift basket dominating the corner, and the new medical device on his great-grandmother's wrist. He looked at me, and his gaze was knowing. Later, while we were doing the dishes, he said, "So that's their answer?" "That's their answer," I confirmed, scrubbing a plate with more force than necessary. "A fruit basket and a panic button," he said, shaking his head. "They really don't get it, do they?" "No, honey, they really don't." Hearing him articulate it so simply, so clearly, was a strange comfort. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't oversensitive. I was just the only one, aside from my son, who spoke the language of the heart. My phone buzzed. It was a text from Karen. "Did Mom get the basket? The florist said it was their finest." I looked at her message, then at the calendar invites from Michael. They had heard my words, but they had not understood the music. They were going through the motions, checking the boxes, performing the role of concerned children in a way that required the least amount of genuine emotional investment. I realized that my outburst hadn't fixed them. It had only revealed, more clearly than ever, the truth of who they were. The silence I had kept for 7 years had been broken, but our family was still fractured. And as I stood there in my mother's quiet kitchen, I had no idea if it could ever be truly whole again. That weekend, while my mother napped, the house settled into a profound quiet. I sat in her sunroom, the light filtering through the dusty leaves of a dozen plants, and opened my laptop. For years, my anger had been a frantic, buzzing thing. Now, a strange and powerful calm guided my fingers as I wrote an email. It was not a plea, nor an attack. It was a declaration of retirement. Subject: moving forward. Michael, Karen. Thank you for the calls, the alert system, and the gift basket. Mom has appreciated hearing from you, and she enjoys the contact. Effective immediately, I will no longer be managing your relationship with her. I am resigning from that role. I will, of course, continue to ensure she is available for your scheduled calls, and I will pass along any messages you send. My focus is on her care and her well-being here, in her home. The rest, the emotional labor of maintaining a connection, the work of bridging the distance you have both created, is no longer my responsibility. That is a responsibility you will have to decide for yourselves how to carry or not carry. Eleanor. My heart hammered against my ribs, not with fear, but with a wild, exhilarating sense of finality. I reread the words. They were cold, perhaps, but they were also the most honest things I had written in 7 years. I hit send before the old, accommodating Eleanor could protest. I closed the laptop. The silence in the house rushed back in, but it sounded different now. It sounded like peace. I received no reply. Not a word. The gaping silence from their end was the only response I needed. It was confirmation. They didn't have the language for this conversation, and they weren't interested in learning it. My email wasn't a stone tossed into a pond to create ripples. It was a stone dropped into a void. And instead of feeling the familiar sting of being ignored, I felt only the quiet rightness of my decision. The burden was no longer mine to carry. The following Wednesday, at 1:59 p.m., I walked into the living room where my mother was reading. "The phone's about to ring, Mom. It'll be Michael." She looked up, a small, pleased smile on her face. As the phone began its shrill summons, I picked it up, pressed the speakerphone button, and set it on the table beside her. "Hi, Michael, she's right here for you," I said brightly. And then I turned and walked away. I didn't retreat to another room to listen with one ear, grading their interaction. I slid open the glass door to the garden, stepped out into the warm afternoon, and knelt in the soft earth. I plunged my hands into the soil, feeling the grit under my fingernails as I began to weed the bed of marigolds. I could hear the faint, tinny drone of Michael's voice from the house, a meaningless background noise, like the hum of a distant lawnmower. It had no power over me. I was no longer a participant, a translator, or a judge. I was simply a daughter, tending her mother's garden while her mother took a phone call. The same ritual followed for Karen's call on Thursday. I made the connection, and then I made my exit. This time, I took a cup of tea to the front porch and watched the finches squabble at the bird feeder. I was listening not for the strained silences in their conversation, but for the chirp and flutter of the birds. When the call was over, my mother shuffled to the kitchen where I was rinsing my cup. "That was nice," she said, her eyes bright. "Karen's youngest is learning the cello, you know. He's very gifted." "That's lovely, Mom," I said, and I meant it. I was happy that she was happy. The performance, the self-absorption, none of it mattered anymore because it wasn't my problem to solve. Her needs were simple: to hear the voices of her children. My siblings, in their own clumsy, detached way, were providing that. It was a shallow, sterile kind of love, but it was the only kind they knew how to give. And for my mother, it was enough. My outburst hadn't been a failure. It was the cracking of a dam. My mistake was thinking the flood was meant to sweep them away. It was meant to free me. I had let go. I had stopped trying to teach a language they would never learn. In doing so, I had not found the family I had always hoped for. I had found something far more precious, something I hadn't even realized I was looking for. Standing there in the quiet of the afternoon, the scent of rain on the breeze, I felt the last 7 years of bitterness wash away. In its place was not a void, but a foundation. I was no longer the resentful keeper of our family's broken emotional heart. I was a woman at peace in her own garden. I was my mother's daughter, and for the first time in a very long time, that was enough.